Thank you so much, Jeannie and Anne. Thank you so much for that. Our speaker this morning is our own Karen Smith Scott. Karen is a 57-year-old married mother of 3 grown children. She has been a member of UCJ for 9 years and currently serves on the board, the worship committee, and the special collections committee. Professionally, Karen has been a nurse for 30 years. She shares her home with her wife, Nicole, 2 dogs and 5 cats, and her yard with 3 chickens and 4 wild bunnies. She is passionate about social justice, the environment, and animals. In her free time, Karen can be found baking and decorating cakes, which are gorgeous, I will tell you, following her endless curiosity down rabbit holes in research, and agreeing to do way more things than her schedule can handle. So welcome, Karen, and thank you.
Good morning. With the summer series theme of where are we going and what is speaking to you now, I want to talk about anti-racism this morning. I want to talk about it because it matters. I want to talk about it because I firmly believe that the survival of our nation depends on it. If we don't get this right, if we don't learn how to value the lives of every person equally as the natural state of who we are at our core, our nation will tear itself apart. And we're well on the way to just that. Civil unrest is already at a boiling point all over the nation. You can't talk about anti-racism without talking about white supremacy, white fragility, and unconscious bias. I know these terms are sometimes confusing and often uncomfortable. You can't talk about anti-racism without knowing and accepting the history that got us where we are now. I know that all of this is a huge topic, but it's one that's worthy of putting the work into. I call this an anti-racist primer because that's all I can provide. I'm not an expert, but I am passionate and I am actively engaged. I'm struggling to get it right just as much as many of you are, but I know that the time is now to sit with the discomfort, to clear up the confusion, to accept the history, to forgive myself when I make a mistake, and to move forward and do better every day. I'm sure that most of you are well familiar with the history of this nation's relationship with Black lives, but I think it bears repeating. It's important to say it again, to remind ourselves of how we got here, where we missed the mark over and over again, and why the fight for racial equality is vital and justified. I want to go through a timeline of the last 401 years of American history, because that's how long it's been since white people brought the first kidnapped and enslaved Black human beings to our shores by force. It started in 1619, and for 244 years, Black people were held as property, not recognized as fully human, and brutalized for the profit of white people. They were forced to provide labor that profited them nothing and made those who abused them wealthy. This, in turn, benefited the other white people around them in ways that are so numerous and so empowering that it is impossible to know them all. Their children and their loved ones were ripped away from them and sold without mercy. This country was quite literally built on the backs of Black slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared that the slaves were free. It's a common misconception that this immediately made all slaves free, but it didn't. The actual liberation only happened as Union soldiers advanced into Confederate territories, and it took 2.5 years to reach the ones in Texas. Additionally, the proclamation only freed the slaves that were held in Confederate states. Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri, and West Virginia were all slaveholding states within the Union. Maryland, Missouri, and West Virginia all adopted abolition before the war ended, but it took the 13th Amendment to free the slaves in Kentucky and Delaware. The grip on white ownership of Black lives was not just a problem in the South, and it was not one that was easily dismantled, even in the face of war and even in the face of law. Most people think that the 13th Amendment completely abolished slavery in the United States, but in reality, it didn't. There is a loophole in the amendment that allows for, quote, involuntary servitude as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Jim Crow laws were quickly enacted. These laws served to control the movement and commerce of the free Black people and to criminalize their actions much more harshly than those of white people. Newly formed police forces were, in most cases, composed of former slave patrol. Slaves had been denied the right to an education and were, in most cases, illiterate and unable to defend themselves in court. So continuing to abuse them was a simple task. This made the arrest and incarceration of Black people easy and justified their return to slavery within the prison system in conditions that were often so brutal that the incarcerated did not survive to finish out their sentences. This was the beginning of the criminal justice system that exists to this day, although a great many white people are completely unaware of the loophole or how it served as the foundation for the wholesale incarceration of Black bodies and the lucrative prison profit system that exists today. In 1868, the 14th Amendment recognized Black people as citizens, which gave them the right to vote, at least on paper. Exercising that right was a dangerous and often deadly pursuit. Voter suppression tactics began in that era and are still being used to this day. In the 89 years from 1865 to 1954, Black communities were ravaged by violence, segregation, economic abuse, and in some cases, the wiping out of entire Black communities, such as the Greenwood community in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and the Rosewood community here in Florida in 1923. Segregation existed unchallenged in law, and as a matter of fact, and hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan were not only allowed to continue their violence unfettered, but its members were often elected into positions of great political power. In 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision desegregated schools, but it did not provide in reality for total education, equal education and opportunity. Schools are funded in most cases by property taxes. Even today, the majority of high-value properties in the United States are in predominantly white neighborhoods, and the schools that serve those neighborhoods are well-funded, modern, beautiful, well-equipped, and able to attract talented teachers. While schools in lower economic and predominantly Black neighborhoods are often in disrepair, lack basic supplies, and have little extracurricular programming. The effect of this on the opportunities for Black children to have an equal education and a chance at future financial and personal success are devastating. This inequality alone is a main contributor to the continuation of the school to prison pipeline and the cycle of generational poverty. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 enshrined non-discrimination based on race into law. While the acts are among the most important federal civil rights legislation ever enacted in the country, words on paper do not stop hatred in the heart. The mere fact that it took 3 separate acts of Congress to try to stop the abuses heaped on Black people who were simply trying to be peaceful, productive citizens with successful contributing lives is clear evidence that the changes needed cannot simply be on paper. It is the defiant belief of a great number of white people today that the passage of these 3 acts ended racism in America. But in the years since, violence, poverty, profiling, and bias have continued virtually unchecked. The historic and chronic suppression of the Black vote meant that the political system in this country, which is supposed to be designed to represent and protect all citizens, has failed to do so. Even today, our political system is predominantly white to an alarming and dysfunctional degree. We cannot possibly hope to pass legislation that is just and equitable to all when there is such a dearth of diversity at all levels of political power and influence. Representation at equitable rates within the political spectrum must happen in order to begin to tip the balance towards justice in this country. And while that is necessary and will go a great distance to make the people we should be, no law by itself can create a change in culture. Those kinds of changes must come from within the people themselves. This fact was made abundantly clear with the election of Barack Obama to the presidency in 2008. This resulted in a backlash of racism. Many people who do not even identify as racist suddenly found themselves challenged. This was a step beyond the pale. It was a signal to them that not only had Black people reached equality, but that they were taking over. This notion is ridiculous, of course. The status quo in their worlds had been knocked from its foundation. Their racism turned into a blinding rage and drove the conservative side of the political spectrum far to the right. Faced with what they believed to be a new political power held by Black liberal people, the conservative-led legislature dismantled key protections of the Voting Rights Act in 2012, declaring it was no longer needed. Almost immediately, measures designed to specifically disenfranchise Black voters, like the purging of voter rolls, increased requirements for voter registration and identification at the polls, and the closing of polling places began and continues unabated still. The fear of the country being taken over and the all-consuming belief in the supremacy and right to dominion of the white race has led many in the alt-right movement to the hoarding of weapons and formation of homegrown militias who are not just ready, but eager to wage war against their own countrymen. At the same time, the availability of social media with its ability to disperse information almost instantly and the ubiquitous presence of cell phones with their cameras has thrust into common view the frequently violent and sometimes deadly use of force against Black bodies by law enforcement. Protests can be organized in a record time. Even peaceful protests are often met with excessive and unnecessary response by a militarized police force. And far-right militia forces attend and disrupt peaceful protests in an attempt to cause chaos and disrupt the message. So, good white people of conscience, what are we to do to fix this? First, we have to understand that there are only two ways of being where racism is concerned. There is being racist, and there is being anti-racist. To be an anti-racist is to support ideas and policies that directly challenge structures of racial inequality and to express anti-racist ideas. The most dangerous racist ideal is the idea of being race neutral, or the idea of not seeing color, because it denies the differences in treatment and opportunity and history that are experienced by people of color and creates the idea of a meritocracy where all rise or fall simply based on their own effort. This is the tool that blames those who have been victimized and disadvantaged for their lack of equity and results in perceiving measures taken to create equity as reverse racism, which, while it may sound logical, by definition is an impossibility. There is no neutral, because to be neutral is to allow violence and injustice to continue, which delays change and directly contributes to racist policies. As it is said now, silence is violence. We also have to learn to conquer white fragility, which is when we feel discomfort and defensiveness when we're confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. Let's be clear. The evil of racism in America was started by white people, championed by white people, perpetuated, nurtured, fed, sustained, protected, and enshrined in law by white people. It is the responsibility of white people to end it. For far too long, we have shirked that responsibility and stood by while we watched our Black brothers and sisters fight for their very lives and been content that it was their fight. We were and are wrong. The fear and discomfort of white guilt is a reality that impedes white people from embracing anti-racism. Often white people feel as though they're being asked to atone for sins they did not commit. So let's talk about the difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt, according to Tim Wise, the author of White Like Me, is something you feel for something you've done, while responsibility is something you take because of the kind of person you are. I hear people say, I shouldn't have to apologize for slavery. The implicit message in owning an apology is that you personally have done something wrong, that you have consciously engaged, in an act of harm. But the reality is that no one is asking you to apologize for slavery. You can't. You didn't do that. You didn't create that system. But you did benefit from it. You have to accept that. And even though you didn't do it, who is left to do the work to correct all of the wrongs created by this system that we have benefited from while others have not? We are. We are left. We have to be the ones to respond. We have had 401 years to prosper unfettered by the shackles of unjust laws, immoral practices, purposeful exclusion, and the wholesale disregard of our right to even exist. And this is one of the roots of the problem. We call it white privilege, and that is what it is. The easiest way to determine whether or not you live under white privilege is simple. Has there ever been a law enacted to protect you from an injustice perpetuated upon you based solely on the color of your skin? Do you have to even really think about the color of your skin as you go through your day? If the answers to those questions is no, then you have white privilege. Really, the question is, are you white? Growing up in white privilege is something that simply happens to us because we are white. Just like growing up under racism is something that happens to others because they are Black. But the culpability begins when we reach an age of social awareness and real social cognizance. If you are old enough to be mortified by the N-word and to know that it is wrong, then you are old enough to begin to see the disparities between whites and Blacks in America. This is when you have a choice to turn a blind eye to that which should have altered your sense of justice and righted your moral compass. Our whole societal norm exists to create an excuse for our blindness, and this makes it common to miss the mark, but it does not excuse it. The only thing that separates those who see injustice without blinders and those who continue to walk around in ignorance is a lack of curiosity. I know that that's simplistic and maybe even a little bit harsh, but it doesn't make it any less true. The onus to act is upon us. It is our turn, and it is way past due. And we are going to make mistakes, and we are going to have to own them and move on and do better. So what are some of the things that we need to be doing? It starts with learning to listen to Black people. Tim Wise says, the benefit of being a member of the dominant group is to have the luxury of being oblivious to the experiences of everyone else. It doesn't make me intentionally oppressive. But if we want to know if oppression is operating in our communities, we have to ask those who are the targets of that oppression, because they are in the best position to know. If I were to step on your foot, it would be kind of silly for someone else to come up to me to ask how it felt. When Black people tell us about their experiences, believe them. We need to learn to swallow our ignorance, our denial, our pride, and our defense. The difference between denial and ignorance is that ignorance is a simple state of not knowing. It can be relatively easy resolved. You find someone who knows what you don't know and you learn from them. But denial is cultivated. It's deliberate. It's willed. It doesn't want to know, and it will fight against knowing. Elevate Black voices. Speak up for Black people, but do not speak for them or over them. They are fully capable of speaking for themselves, and they need to be heard. When the narrative always comes from white voices, we have rendered Black voices powerless. The days of Black men pinned on the ground, pleading just to breathe while under the knee of a white police officer, while the community around him begs for his life, going completely unheard, must end. It should never again be that a young Black man on the subway can tell a white transit officer 7 times that even though he is also Black, he was not part of the group that was just removed from the train. And it goes completely unheard until a white woman tells the officer the same thing. We must insist that they are heard. We must insist that they are respected. Have uncomfortable conversations with family and friends. Find opportunities in conversation to correct the thinking of people around you. Learn the common counter narratives that are used to defend or distract so that you can keep the conversation on topic. Be calm and compassionate, but insistent. Don't let bad behavior go unchallenged. When someone near you treats a person of color with disregard, ridicule, and violence, respond like they are doing it to your child, your mother, your friend. The best way to stop racist behavior is to challenge it openly. It is perpetuated because it is not exposed and rejected. Value and respect Black culture, Black language, Black music, Black fashion, Black lifestyle. Accept and embrace that it is simply culture, language, music, fashion, and lifestyle. Stop seeing it and identifying it as something separate. We as white people have co-opted and appropriated Black culture for so long. Why do we continue to deny and belittle its value? Educate yourself about legal slavery, prison injustice, wrongful conviction, inherent bias, and the history of laws and practices specifically designed to incarcerate and control Black lives. Be vocal about it. Serve on juries when you are called. Your anti-racist presence there could quite literally save someone's life. Vote. 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 Never miss the chance to vote. Encourage others to vote. Contact Black voter organizations and provide rides to the polls if you can. Support Black candidates for office even when they're not in your district. Fundraising is one of the most important ways to show support. The most efficient way to change unjust laws and practices is to increase the representation of people who have been affected by unjust laws. A just society will have equitable representation in the courts, the legislatures, and in all positions of political power. Ibrahim X. Kendi says, "We all have the power to discriminate, but only an exclusive few have the power to make policy." Accept that we all have unconscious bias. Do not run from it when you find it. The best we can do is to learn from each mistake and do better the next time. Resist the urge to feel comfortable in your accomplishments as you practice anti-racism. Almost anyone is capable of performative activities. Anti-racism is not real until it becomes part of your DNA. Work until it becomes your automatic response and your natural state. In 1978, US Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must first treat them differently. Indeed, there is no repairing the damage without offering protections from further damage first." How many men and women of conscience have given the entirety of their lives to the formation of such protections, and yet still here we are? It's been 2 weeks since the deaths of C.T. Vivian and John Lewis. And just as it was after the deaths of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Daisy Bates, A. Philip Randolph, and so many others, folks are asking, who is going to take up the mantle? I propose that the only clear and correct answer is, we are. Thank you.